Welcome to Trend Reddit, where I share interesting, useful, and inspiring content. Let's explore the world together through the videos I create. Don't forget to click the follow button so you don't miss. Jessica Carter, a petite 7-year-old girl with golden blonde hair and wide, curious eyes, sat nervously beside her father in row 12 of the airplane. The hum of the engines did little to soothe her as she clutched tightly to her father's hand, her knuckles white with tension. Thomas Carter, her father, appeared completely oblivious to her anxiety. His attention was fixed on his phone, his fingers flying over the screen as he typed out emails or messages, barely acknowledging Jessica's presence. Jessica fidgeted in her seat, her gaze darting around the cabin, scanning the faces of the other passengers. Her heart pounded in her chest, a sensation she couldn't shake off since they had boarded. Her father hadn't spoken much since they left home, and the strange, uncomfortable silence between them only heightened her sense of unease. A few rows up, Evan Blake, the flight attendant, was making his way through the aisle, checking on passengers with his usual calm and professional demeanor. He had seen all types of travelers in his years of experience, but something about the little girl caught his attention. Her eyes, filled with a mix of fear and desperation, momentarily locked with his as he passed by. It was a fleeting connection, but it was enough to make Evan pause. Evan was known among his peers for his keen sense of observation. It was part of what made him so good at his job. He could often sense when something was amiss before it escalated into a problem. Today, that intuition was nudging him toward row 12, where Jessica sat with her father. As he continued down the aisle, a nagging feeling of unease crept up on him. He noticed how tightly Jessica was gripping her father's hand, her small body tense, her shoulders drawn up as if bracing for something. Her father, on the other hand, seemed detached, absorbed in his own world, barely paying her any attention. When Evan reached their row, Jessica did something unexpected. She tugged lightly on his sleeve as he passed by, her voice a soft, shaky whisper, "I'm scared. I don't want to be here." Evan crouched slightly to meet her eye level, offering a reassuring smile. Before he could respond, Thomas glanced up from his phone, his face hardening. "Don't bother the flight attendant, Jessica," he said coldly, his voice sharp. Jessica flinched, her grip on her father's hand tightening even more. Evan gave a polite nod and moved on, but his mind stayed on the exchange. Something didn't feel right. As he continued his rounds, he couldn't shake the image of Jessica's pleading eyes or the tension that seemed to hang over her like a dark cloud. He made a mental note to keep an eye on them throughout the flight. Minutes passed, and as Evan walked through the aisle again, he glanced back at Jessica. To his surprise, she was making subtle gestures with her hands, as if trying to signal something. It was a strange motion. She repeated it several times until Evan realized she was spelling something out. His heart skipped a beat as he deciphered the letters, HELP. Evan's calm exterior masked the rising concern inside him. He glanced at Thomas, who remained fixated on his phone, unaware of his daughter's silent plea for help. Something was very wrong, and Evan knew he couldn't ignore it. He needed to act, but he had to be careful. He couldn't risk alerting Thomas just yet. Evan discreetly motioned to another flight attendant, Mia Cooper, who joined him at the back of the plane. Together, they exchanged quiet, hurried whispers, formulating a plan to understand what was really going on with the girl in row 12. As the plane took off, Evan continued his routine, walking up and down the aisles, ensuring passengers were comfortable. His thoughts, however, kept drifting back to Jessica and her unusual behavior. There was something about the way she had spelled out help that sent chills down his spine. He couldn't shake the image of her frightened face. Every time he passed by row 12, he caught Jessica glancing at him, her eyes silently pleading. Evan approached Jessica and Thomas again, this time with a tray of drinks, using it as a pretense to get closer. He leaned slightly toward Jessica, his eyes meeting hers briefly, but just long enough to sense her fear. "Would you like something to drink?" he asked politely, offering the father and daughter a choice of beverages. Jessica didn't respond, her gaze locked onto her father, clearly too scared to say anything. Thomas, distracted as usual by his phone, barely glanced up as he coldly said, "We're fine, thank you." As Evan walked away, he felt Jessica's small hand discreetly tug on his sleeve again. This time, she whispered just loud enough for him to hear, "I don't want to be here." Her voice trembled, filled with a fear that sent alarm bells ringing in Evan's mind. He knew he needed to do something, but it had to be subtle. If he made a move too quickly or raised suspicion, it could make things worse for Jessica. Her father's cold and controlling demeanor was all too evident. Evan returned to the flight attendants' area at the back of the plane, where Mia was organizing the snack trays. He leaned in, his voice low, as he explained what he had seen and heard. "Something's off with the girl in row 12, he said. She spelled out help with her hands. I'm worried she's in trouble." Mia looked up, concern flashing in her eyes. "What do you think we should do?" "I don't know yet, but I need to find a way to talk to her without her father noticing." "She's clearly terrified of him," Evan replied. Mia nodded, her expression serious. "We need to be careful. If her father is dangerous, we can't let him know we're onto him." Together, they decided that Evan would try to communicate with Jessica in a more direct way. The goal was to get her away from her father, even if just for a moment, to understand the full situation. Later, when the cabin lights dimmed for the in-flight movie, Evan used the cover of darkness to make another pass by row 12. This time, he discreetly slipped a small note into Jessica's lap as he walked by. The note simply read, "Are you in danger?" Jessica unfolded the note under the tray table, her small fingers trembling as she read it. She glanced around nervously, her father still engrossed in his phone, unaware of what was happening. Slowly, she gave the smallest of nods, confirming Evan's worst fears. Evan's heart raced, but he knew he had to stay calm. His next move would be critical. As the plane continued its journey, he waited for the right moment to act, keeping a close watch on Jessica and her father, determined to protect the little girl from whatever danger she was facing. During a brief lull in the flight service, Evan seized the opportunity to communicate further with Jessica. He noticed her father was distracted, scrolling through his phone as usual. Evan moved swiftly, leaning down beside Jessica, his voice barely a whisper. "Do you need help?" he asked, his face calm, hiding the urgency he felt inside. "If you find it interesting, please like it. If not, please comment number 1. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this video." Jessica hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting to her father. She nodded slightly, enough for Evan to see, but her fear was palpable. Evan's heart sank. He knew he had to act quickly but cautiously, without alarming her father. He handed Jessica a small napkin with another quick message scribbled on it, "Meet me in the restroom when it's safe." Jessica clutched the napkin tightly, nodding again, but this time her movements were more deliberate. Evan gave her a reassuring smile before retreating to the flight attendants' area. He waited patiently, his pulse quickening as he watched the minutes tick by. Finally, the moment came. Jessica managed to slip away from her seat while her father was absorbed in a long phone call, his attention completely elsewhere. She moved carefully down the aisle, her small figure tense and cautious, until she reached the restroom where Evan was waiting. She quickly slipped inside, and Evan followed, closing the door gently behind them. Tears welled up in Jessica's eyes the moment she was out of her father's sight. "He took me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He took me without telling my mom. I'm scared I won't see her again." Evan knelt beside her, his heart breaking at the fear in her voice. "Don't worry," he said softly. "I'm going to make sure you're safe, okay? We're going to get you back to your mom." Jessica nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, trusting Evan completely. He knew time was running out, he had to act before Thomas realized she was gone. Evan stepped out of the restroom, flagged down Mia, and quickly explained the situation. "We need to alert the pilot," Evan said firmly. "He can contact the authorities so they're ready when we land." Mia's face was serious as she nodded in agreement. Together, they relayed the message to the pilot, who assured them that police would be waiting at the airport. The tension in the air was thick as the plane continued its descent, with Evan and Mia keeping a watchful eye on Jessica and her father. As the flight neared its destination, Evan's nerves were on edge. He could feel the danger looming, especially with Thomas starting to notice the increased attention on his daughter. His eyes darted around suspiciously, sensing that something was wrong. Evan did his best to maintain his composure, making sure not to draw any unnecessary attention. The final moments of the flight felt like a ticking clock. Every second that passed brought them closer to landing, and closer to the confrontation that Evan knew was inevitable. He and Mia discreetly coordinated with the rest of the crew to ensure everything was in place for a safe landing and that Jessica would be protected as soon as they touched down. The plan was set in motion, and now all they had to do was wait. As the wheels of the plane touched the runway, Evan braced himself for what was about to unfold, his mind racing with thoughts of Jessica's safety. He was determined to see this through, no matter the cost. As the plane landed, Evan and Mia moved swiftly to put their plan into action. Mia made an announcement over the intercom, instructing passengers to disembark quickly due to a supposed technical issue. The fabricated reason caused confusion among the passengers, but it also created the distraction they needed. Evan's eyes stayed locked on Jessica and Thomas as passengers began gathering their belongings and heading toward the exit. Evan moved closer to row 12, where Jessica sat nervously. Her father, Thomas, seemed oblivious to the unusual activity around him as he put his phone away and prepared to disembark. Evan knew this was the critical moment. He couldn't afford for Thomas to become suspicious. As passengers filed out, Evan gently placed a hand on Jessica's shoulder, signaling her to follow him. "Come with me, sweetheart," he said softly, his voice calm yet authoritative. Thomas glanced at Evan, his expression hardening. "Where are you taking her?" he asked, suspicion creeping into his tone. "There's a slight issue with our disembarkation process," Evan explained smoothly, not missing a beat. "I just need to escort her out with the rest of the passengers." Thomas hesitated, his eyes narrowing, but Evan didn't give him a chance to argue. "Please, just follow me," he added firmly. The tone in Evan's voice left no room for further questions. Thomas reluctantly nodded and stood up, gathering his things. Evan led Jessica toward the front of the plane, keeping her close as they maneuvered through the remaining passengers. Mia was at the door, discreetly signaling to the undercover officers waiting at the terminal. As they reached the exit, two officers stepped forward, their presence blending in with the hustle and bustle of passengers disembarking. The moment Jessica stepped off the plane, the officers moved swiftly. One officer gently took Jessica's hand, while the other approached Thomas. Realizing what was happening, Thomas's face twisted in shock and anger. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, his voice rising. Before he could move, the officers restrained him, quickly subduing him as he attempted to approach Jessica. "That's my daughter," Thomas shouted, struggling against the officer's hold. "You can't do this." Jessica watched, her eyes wide with fear, but Evan knelt down beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It's okay," he whispered. "You're safe now." Thomas continued to shout, insisting that Jessica was his, but the officers kept him restrained, preventing him from getting anywhere near her. His aggressive behavior only confirmed to Evan that something had been terribly wrong from the start. Jessica was escorted to a waiting group of social workers and police officers who quickly took her to a safe area away from the chaos. Evan stood by, watching as she was led away, feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion wash over him. He had done what he needed to do. As Thomas was dragged away in handcuffs, still shouting about his rights, Evan exchanged a glance with Mia, both of them silently acknowledging that they had averted a potentially tragic situation. Jessica was safely taken away by the police and social workers, who reassured her that everything would be all right. Despite the chaotic scene unfolding behind her, she seemed calmer now, her small body no longer shaking with fear. The social workers spoke to her in soothing tones, and one of them gently took her hand, leading her toward a quieter area of the terminal where she would be safe from the sight of her father. Evan watched as Jessica disappeared into the crowd, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. His heart was still pounding from the tension of the last few hours, but knowing that Jessica was now out of danger gave him a deep sense of satisfaction. He had done the right thing, and the weight of that realization settled over him like a warm blanket. As he stepped out of the terminal, ready to catch his breath and process everything that had happened, Evan spotted a woman running frantically toward the police and social workers. It was Amanda Carter, Jessica's mother. Tears streamed down her face as she rushed to reunite with her daughter. The moment Jessica saw her mother, she broke into a sprint, her little legs carrying her as fast as they could. "Mom!" Jessica cried, throwing herself into Amanda's arms. Amanda knelt down, enveloping her daughter in a tight embrace, her face buried in Jessica's hair. Both mother and daughter cried together, the relief and emotion pouring out of them. Evan stood off to the side, watching the reunion with a soft smile on his face. He didn't need to be involved in this part, this was Jessica's moment, and seeing her back with her mother was all the closure he needed. Still, he felt a deep sense of accomplishment for the role he had played in reuniting them. After a few minutes, Amanda approached Evan, her eyes red from crying, but filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you so much for saving my daughter." Evan smiled modestly, shaking his head. "I'm just glad she's safe," he replied. "She's a brave little girl." Amanda nodded, tears welling up in her eyes again. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in. I don't even want to think about it." Evan placed a reassuring hand on Amanda's shoulder. "You don't have to think about that now," he said softly. "She's safe, and that's what matters." As Amanda led Jessica away, surrounded by the comforting presence of the police and social workers, Evan lingered for a moment longer, watching them go. The terminal was beginning to quiet down as the rest of the passengers went about their business, unaware of the dramatic events that had just unfolded. Evan felt a deep sense of fulfillment as he turned to leave the airport. This wasn't the first time he had dealt with a difficult situation on a flight, but something about this one felt different. He knew he had made a real difference in someone's life today, something that would stay with him long after the flight was forgotten by everyone else. As he stepped outside into the fresh air, Evan took a deep breath and smiled to himself. Today had been a good day. He had followed his instincts, and because of that, a little girl was back with her mother. It was a day he wouldn't soon forget. Thank you for listening. See you in the next episode. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Goodbye.